Hello, I'm David Sykes from PRMA Consulting. Welcome to our webinar today on Market Access Update, Key Learnings from EHA and ASCO. I'm joined by my colleague Claire Jones to share our observations and thoughts from ASCO and EHA and how these impact market access in the future. Before we get into the content, just some housekeeping about how to participate. At the end of the presentation, we will have time for questions. Please type your questions in the lower box on the dash panel as illustrated on this slide. We will aim to answer all the questions. If time doesn't permit, then we will get back to those individuals after the webinar. Please note that questions will only be visible to the PRMA team. At PRMA, we have significant experience in oncology with over 3/4 of our work undertaken in this area, broadly split between solid and hem-onc tumours. This webinar today builds on our spring series of 2006 and some of the themes we have presented in previous webinars which are highlighted in this slide. Key areas that we focused on were early access learnings with PD-1 inhibitors, the role of value frameworks in oncology, and valuing combinations. If anybody would like access to these slides, please visit our website. As I mentioned, the team have been in attendance at ASCO and EHA, and the contents of this webinar today are based on previous webinars and our observations from those two cancer conferences, as well as ISFOR and HTAI. As we all know, the oncology landscape is complex and rapidly evolving. And the webinar today splits this down into two key themes: the treatment landscape and the payer landscape. Firstly, the treatment landscape. We've seen rapid developments in the understanding of cancer biology, and accelerated regulatory approvals have led to innovative drugs coming to market with immature data sets and a focus on intermediate endpoints. The payer landscape is also rapidly evolving, with lessons from melanoma being applied to other tumours, concepts of affordability and value becoming mainstream in the press and everyday conversation. Payers very focused on trying to splinter indications into subgroups with different cheaper comparators. The whole concept of uncertainty has led to a downward spiral on pricing pressures OUS. So the webinar today separates out those two key themes. My colleague Claire Jones will take the treatment landscape part, and then we'll pass back to me for the payer landscape piece. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Claire to take you through the next issues.
Thanks, David, and hello, everybody. So as David said, I'm going to be talking to the treatment landscape, and we've split this into these three broad themes of the increasing number of treatment options, the increasing use of patient populations, and quality of survival. But before I really go into the slides on treatment options, I just wanted to briefly review some of the activity at ASCO. So looking at the top 5 deadly cancers, it's no surprise to see that there were huge numbers of presentations in lung cancer, breast cancer, CRC, prostate. But we've also just added the activity in melanoma and multiple myeloma, where we've seen several new products launch over recent months and years. And then also renal and gastric, again where there's been recent activity. But for me, the data on IMAB 362 that really caught my eye was what really caught my eye at ASCO. So let's hope that we're going to see some improvements in outcomes in gastric cancer soon. Then looking at EHA, similarly, you might expect there was a lot of activity and presentations around myeloma with being top of the table. but also some of the smaller indications such as AML, where there are a lot of presentations relative to the size of the patient population, indicating a lot of activity and drug development going on here. So moving on to focus on the current topic, the expanding number of treatment options. What do we see at the meetings? I'm going to talk about this across a number of categories, starting with the regulatory landscape and then moving around the boxes that you see on the slide. So we would say that the current regulatory environment is changing and uncertain. We've seen a number of initiatives around accelerating approvals, and these approvals are often arrive based on limited data packages. We saw additional data for several products which have benefited from rapid approval at both ASCO and EHA. So taking blinatumomab and daratumumab as examples, both received rapid approvals based on phase 2 single-arm trials. So I think the impressive confirmatory phase 3 data coming out at EHA really seemed to back these regulatory decisions. That said, we're all aware that launching on a phase 2 single-arm trial presents significant challenges from a market access perspective. So what's happened here is, in looking at the market access landscape, is that Blincyto and daratumumab now go into pricing and or reimbursement assessments in Europe and other jurisdictions outside the US with confirmatory phase 3 data, even though that data may not be fully mature in the case of Pollux and Castor. That data is there. And I think the implication for manufacturers is that to strengthen their position, or to strengthen your position, it's essential to make sure that a robust phase 3 confirmatory program is in place and the data is available, even if it's still immature, at the time of P&R negotiations. Then we also saw further data at ASCO and EHA for elotuzumab. This received a breakthrough designation, priority review, and was an orphan designated product from the FDA, and then accelerated assessment in Europe for the treatment of multiple relapsed and refractory multiple myeloma. At the time of the CHMP positive opinion, elotuzumab had OD orphan drug status in Europe too, but I'm sure many of us were surprised to see this removed. So the COMP performed an indirect comparison of registrational studies against carfilzomib and found that there was no longer the criteria of significant benefit was no longer met, and that was the basis of the removal of the orphan designation. So I think this is almost unprecedented and happened very late in the day with huge implications for access. In some jurisdictions, Sweden and Italy, for example, the P&R submission can be made at the time of CHMP positive opinion. So a manufacturer could find themselves being assessed in a very different environment to the one they anticipated. And for example, in Germany, as many of you will be aware, it completely changes the size of the dossier demanded by the GBA. To note, although the CHMP opinion for ixazomib was negative, its orphan designation was also on the agenda for review by COMP at the same meeting as for elotuzumab. Finally, for this rather long slide, I promise I'll have less to say about the rest of my slides, there was further data released for all of the CAR-Ts at ASCO and EHA. But here on the slide, we're making the point that in the case of KTEC19, this is one of the first 2 products to be selected for the EMA's PRIME initiative. So it's therefore recognized as of major public health interest. So this means that, like adaptive pathways, they'll also participate in early scientific advice and HTA advice, parallel EMA and HTA advice, but with a lot of attention from the EMA. So, moving on, in addition to the regulatory landscape driving the emergence of new treatment options, we've also had the fast-paced expansion of novel therapies into additional indications. In the past, we've seen other antibodies across multiple indications, bevacizumab and cetuximab spring to mind as examples, but nothing on the scale of what we're seeing now with PD-1 inhibitors. So here on the slide, we see what Pembro and Nivo have already achieved, and we need to remember that each new indication can be an opportunity for payers to renegotiate price. But this doesn't seem to have deterred manufacturers from going for multiple indications. We saw additional data for both of these PD-1 inhibitors and the others across multiple indications. So I have a challenge for you, just to wake you up and see if you're listening and thinking. Can anyone think of a solid tumour where PD-1 inhibitors are not currently being investigated in clinical trials? If you type your suggestions in the question box on the panel, we'll try and get to them during question time. So moving on to combinations, looking just at Keytruda and Opdivo and Yervoy here for now, but we've seen a wide range of oncology indications, the emergence of treatment of monotherapies, doublets, triplets, and even the potential for quads. There are several triplets in multiple myeloma already, and more on the way. But just looking at Keytruda here, there were the ASCO data included results from 10 combinations, and there are more than 100 ongoing trials with other therapies. And then for Opdivo and Yervoy, there were 20 ongoing studies combining nivolumab and ipilimumab presented at ASCO, and 7 of those are potential registration studies. Looking beyond just these 2 PD-1 inhibitors and across just Roche's portfolio, in this elegant diagram from their investor presentation at ASCO, highlights some of the many potential combinations which Roche alone have approved or investigating. So combinations, but also sequencing of immunotherapies and targeted therapies was a point of discussion in several of the presentations that I saw. And this is a challenge for clinicians, let alone payers, as clinical guidelines can't hope to keep pace with the development and the rapidity with which we're seeing new products launching in some indications. So the standard of care is changing very quickly in some of these indications, and there's the synthesis of the evidence to an appropriate level for decision making, whether that's payer decision making or clinical decision making, is a real challenge, I think. So having spent some time looking at the ever-increasing number of treatment options, I'll now talk more briefly about patient populations and quality of survival as other key themes from the meetings that are of particular relevance for market access. So with the deeper understanding that we have of cancer biology, we've seen a number of indications kind of splintering, as it were. So we've seen this in breast cancer, starting with hormone receptor status and then the molecular markers. But there's no doubt that this trend is set to continue. So as we better understand the mechanisms of cancer, it opens the door to far more mechanisms of action. But also the possibility for manufacturers to identify a population where their product can demonstrate the most benefit to potentially win a higher price, even if that is at the cost of initial volume. So with NSCLC, we see this split both by histology into squamous and non-squamous, and by molecular markers. So kind of looking forward, in 2 or 3 years' time, I wonder how many other molecular markers. I'm not sure that we haven't got MET up there, or BRAF I know is of interest in NSCLC as well. So that list is rapidly expanding. Again, we saw a number of basket trials presenting some results at ASCO. So this story is very much unfolding, and I think certainly market access for products and even regulatory, the regulatory pathway for products involved in basket trials could be the subject of a whole series of webinars. Beyond histology and molecularly defined subgroups, of course there's other characteristics on which to base subgroups. Here, as an example here, there's the frail and elderly population in CLL. So some of the implications of this trend of increasing subgroups or subpopulations include difficulties in choosing the appropriate comparator for a trial, or establishing comparative efficacy if new subgroups emerge during development. So this demands a constant monitoring of the landscape, flexibility, and additional evidence generation to avoid payers being able to dilute the value of a product during HTA assessment and pricing negotiations. So finally, before I hand over to David, quality of survival. There was a record number of abstracts mentioning quality of life. The chart on this screen shows not the quality of life of ASCO attendees, as everyone learns shortcuts from room to room around the convention centre, but in fact the growth in the number of abstracts over last year, after the last few years here. So we see the increasing importance of this with payers. It's not just about getting to utility values for cost-effectiveness analysis anymore. Quality, not just quantity, of survival is key. So there was a whole session on the Monday afternoon of ASCO looking at how to use PROs to capture the impact of adverse events. AE profiles and their impact on quality of life are a real focus for payers already, and become ever more important in the context of an increasingly competitive marketplace. And with combinations, it's important to establish that the synergistic effects of the therapies doesn't come at too high a quality of life cost. So now I'll hand back to David as he takes you through the evolving payer landscape.
Thanks, Claire. So I'm going to focus on some of our observations from ASCO and EHA in terms of where we think this reads out from an access perspective. And I think obviously there's a lot of interest around the whole context of value frameworks. And so value was a key theme at all the conferences we attended, whether this be from a patient, payer, or clinician perspective. As we're all aware, and you can see on this slide, we've seen a number of initiatives launched in 2015 aimed at trying to provide guidance to different stakeholders to help make better informed value-based decision making. And so on the eve of this year's ASCO conference, the second version of the ASCO value framework was published. So this publication was an updated framework for assessing the relative value of cancer therapies compared in clinical trials. So it's not looking at the totality of evidence, it's just looking at the clinical trial-based data. And as a reminder, this framework attempts to define value as a combination of clinical benefit, adverse events, and improvements in patient symptoms or quality of life in the context of cost. And so you can see here in this table, it's split out into the advanced setting and the adjuvant setting as well. I'm just going to focus mainly on the advanced setting here. So value frameworks now allow scoring on hazard ratios, not just on median PFS and OS, So now you can score with immature survival data, which is obviously more consistent with the regulatory vision around enhanced and accelerated regulatory approval. Efficacy scoring is also now continuous and not discrete. And interestingly, the weights of allocated to overall survival, progression-free survival, and response rates have been changed in favor of intermediate endpoints. What's also interesting as well is the tail of the curve bonus has been added in here as well. So this reflects a willingness to compensate for a long tail, but interestingly doesn't account for numbers at risk. So I think there's still some work to be done on that element. And also there's more complexity brought into the toxicity scoring as well. So I think ASCO have recognised they needed to develop this. There's still a potential number of challenges and issues associated with the relative weights and how they've approached those. And then, of course, the big question is, how are these frameworks going to be used in the real world to help inform decision makers? But there's no doubt that at ASCO and EHA, this was an absolute core part of the discussion. And you'll also be aware with the recent ISA review in multiple myeloma, they've been working very hard at that over the last few months. And we've seen early assessments, and as Claire talked about at ASCO and EHA, we've had data from Darzalex from the Pollux and Castor trial that was published at these conferences, showing impressive data, but this wasn't captured in the ISA review for the myeloma drug. So this just underlies how important timing is in the context of these assessments, and also begs the question as to how often these evaluations should be updated given the rapidity of change in the landscape, and also that products are quickly delivering more certainty about their outcomes and hence more confidence in the value they offer. Claire also talked about some of the data from the CAR-T manufacturers presented at ASCO and EHA. And the leading CAR-T manufacturers highlighted on this slide presented data on their respective assets at these conferences. And I'm not going to go through the data, but it just goes to show that there's more mature data coming through, more confidence in the early promise that these technologies have offered, and there's a lot of excitement about how these technologies could serve patient populations with a very high unmet need where limited or no treatment options exist. But interestingly, from an access perspective, these complex and innovative technologies create a particular set of challenges in some countries for inherently conservative, risk-averse payers. As Claire also mentioned, the KITE product has been selected through the EMA Prime system, which potentially allows an accelerated approval, and so we're going to be potentially dealing with payer evaluations of these products from 2017 onwards. So the big question is, how will payers react to these highly complex technologies, coming to market with phase 2 single-arm data, intermediate endpoints, but that potentially offer a cure? Obviously, this is in the face of potential one-off high upfront payments with significant levels of associated uncertainty. And this scenario, in combination with the multiple combinations that are being rapidly developed, will require manufacturers to think about market access approaches very differently to how they previously have. Payers have tended to focus on simple price discount or price volume agreements, and you can see some of the financial and outcomes-based schemes highlighted in this slide. But manufacturers are going to have to think creatively about managed entry agreements which genuinely share risk and reduce uncertainty in the context of these new technologies. as well as mechanisms for indication-specific pricing. And we've seen the avalanche of indications that are coming through with a number of these new agents. So I think it's fair to say that the pricing of pharmaceuticals will get a whole lot more complex, and the implications for data generation from a real world and trial-based perspective, the levels of creativity and sophistication in designing managed entry schemes, stress testing them internally and externally will require a different approach, and strong cross-functional education, awareness and alignment on strategy. And I think it's fair to say that getting your managed entry agreement right will be material to the success of your product. So I just wanted to summarize with a similar slide to how we started, and I think as we've reinforced and as we've seen at ASCO and EHA, cancer biology is leading to rapid advances and opening up earlier regulatory approval pathways, and that brings a complexity and a rapidity of change here that's unprecedented. Clinical guidelines are unable to keep up with changes in the treatment landscape, with implications for clinicians being able to synthesize and understand the evidence and make informed treatment decisions, not just at the KOL level, but also at the practicing clinician level as well. So I think it's fair to say that that really broadens the market access challenge out a couple of different levels to what we've been used to. We've talked about combinations, we've talked about intermediate endpoints, we've talked about indication splintering. All these concepts came through loud and clear at ASCO and EHA. All of these increase payer uncertainty. These payers are very well educated after the melanoma experience, inherently conservative, and it's incumbent on manufacturers to make sure they're able to understand, anticipate, and prepare effective managed entry agreements in order to be able to drive commercial success. So with that in mind, I'm going to open up to questions now, and we've had a number of questions that have come through from the floor. So the first question that I'll take is relates to why do we think the learnings in melanoma will be replicated through to other tumour types? And so perhaps I'll take that first, Claire, and feel free to add on to that. We've seen melanoma being the poster child for payer education with the advent of immunotherapies and targeted agents in a rapid and short period of time. So payers have been able to really start to understand some of the differential issues around the tail of the curve, around combinations, around quality of survival, around managing adverse events, etc., 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 and the whole concept of treatment sequencing. So I think we strongly believe, and we're starting to see that now, that learning is pretty much institutionalized across the key payer authorities, and they are starting to apply that now to lung, to renal, to CLL, and that is basically the starting point for the way products are going to be evaluated. Claire, did you want to add anything on to that?
No, I don't think so. I would just say that the fact that the ASCO framework has picked up on the bonus points for the tail of the curve just underscores, I think it all started with melanoma, maybe.
Yeah, good, yeah. What is any thoughts as to where you see PD-L1 as a biomarker moving based on your observations?
Oh, that's a good question. I went into ASCO hoping that there would be some clear answers, or I'd seen some of the literature about using neutrophil counts in the tumour as a biomarker, and these types of approaches. But I don't think anybody's really any clearer PD1 and PD-L1 is still expression is still an important biomarker, but I don't think it's being routinely used. And I think the search is still on for the appropriate biomarkers. It's probably going to be different in different tumour contexts, and likely we're moving towards panels, just as we will see panels coming in lung cancer, colorectal cancer, probably breast cancer. I think we'll probably start to see panels of biomarkers rather than just one. We have had one respondent top marks to the person who suggested that neuroendocrine tumours may be one tumour type in which there aren't any PD-1 inhibitors being investigated at the moment. We haven't confirmed that, but to the person who suggested that, you know who you are. Well done.
So the next question, perhaps I'll have a first go, Claire. This relates to the quality of survival and quality of life, and the question is the value of quality of life from a label perspective. I think it's fair to say that many oncology drugs don't have a label language around quality of life. And I think certainly all our interactions with payers suggest that they're less concerned about whether the PRO or HRQL data is in the label, as opposed to it's been assessed and interrogated using a validated, appropriate instrument, it's been reported appropriately, and people can start to see how that translates over time in the context of the treatment setting. Claire, did you want to add anything on to that? No? Okay. Thank you. One other question relates to basket and umbrella trials. How does this potentially fit in from an access perspective? That's a difficult question, so I'm going to hand that to Claire.
As I suggested, I think that could be a whole nother topic. But for those who aren't aware, a basket trial, basically you profile a patient's tumour and treat based on the molecular profile rather than the location of the tumour. So there's a number of these trials, those that reported that I saw at ASCO, but there may have been a few other. I think there may have been a few others with specific drugs. The French initiative, AXE, My Pathway, and the ASCO initiative, TAPER. So certainly the results looked promising in these trials, and I think there's a lot of excitement as that being an appropriate way to treat and to introduce precision medicine or personalized or stratified medicine, whichever term you want to use. But certainly for me, the regulatory pathway is not clear, and the access pathway I think will follow. It may be a little bit more straightforward for those products that are already indicated in other tumour types. So an EGFR inhibitor, for example, moving out of lung cancer into a number of different tumour types where that EGFR mutation is present. That's maybe possible, but whether it would be at the moment, of course, that would be off-label use. So we're yet to see how the regulatory and access landscape will play out for those.
Great. Thanks, Claire. So we just got one last question here, I believe, which relates to value scales or value frameworks, and which of these are having the most influence on payers or prescribers. I think it's fair to say this is very early in the development of these value frameworks. There's a lot of controversy about how they've been developed. whose preferences and weights are driving these and how applicable and relevant they are. So I think it's fair to say they are work in progress. Certainly the feedback we're getting is that these are not having an impact at the minute in terms of payers or prescribers. They're certainly on people's radars, but they're definitely here to stay. I think ISA potentially has more of an impact at the minute given the noise and publicity it's creating, and we've seen that with multiple myeloma, HCV, and we'll see that very soon with the non-small cell lung cancer assessment as well. So, but at the minute, I think it's fair to say these frameworks are having limited, if any, impact on payers or prescribers. So the last question, with increased uncertainty regarding survival benefit and surrogate endpoints, do you see risk sharing evolving towards outcomes-based schemes? I think it's absolutely clear that that's going to happen. You know, payers, inherently conservative, risk averse, have really wanted to focus on price discount schemes, but I think manufacturers, it's in their interest now to start thinking about how they move the debate onto more complex managed entry agreements or outcomes-based schemes as well. And I think it's really critical to start thinking about those things very, very early, because there's a lot of data that you can generate there to bring into that discussion, to share in that negotiation with the payers as well. So thanks very much to everybody for their questions and their attention. If there are any follow-up questions after the webinar, feel free to drop us a note, and we wish you a good day. Thank you.